Welcome to our deep dive into Don't Be Sad, a book that, well, it's kind of like a roadmap to happiness,
Mm.
you know, using the wisdom of Islam.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it. And what's really cool is how the book draws on so many different sources. You've got Quranic verses in there
Oh, yeah.
and stories about the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him,
Right.
and even sayings of like Islamic scholars through the ages.
It is like the author went all around the world and was like, okay, what are the best pieces of advice about happiness?
Yeah, and put it all together for us.
Yeah.
And the other thing that's really interesting is that it's not just like theoretical, it's really action-oriented.
Okay.
The author keeps reminding us that Allah wants us to be happy, and the whole book is about showing us how we can actually align our lives with that,
Wow.
with that divine will.
Okay, I love that. I think that's a great place to start then. Like, what is the author trying to do here?
Yeah.
And how does he use all these sources that you mentioned to kind of achieve that goal?
Okay, well, let's start with the publisher's note, because that kind of gives us a clue, right? What jumped out at you from that?
The publisher's really emphasizing that this book isn't just for Muslims.
Right.
They're saying anyone who's struggling with sadness, anyone who's going through a hard time, can benefit from this advice.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. It kind of implies that there's something universal about the Islamic approach to happiness, you know? What do you think?
Yeah, I think so. Like,
Yeah.
what is that?
You're kind of saying that it's not just about specific religious practices, but that there's something about the Islamic mindset or like a way of seeing the world that can lead to happiness.
Yeah, precisely.
Yeah.
And the author really emphasizes that that mindset can then lead to concrete actions, like practical steps that you can take to overcome sadness and hardship and create a happier life.
Okay, that's really fascinating. So how does he actually do that then?
How does he take these Islamic teachings and make them practical?
Yeah.
One of the most striking things, I think, is the way he weaves personal anecdotes, stories.
Together with these Islamic teachings.
Okay.
So, for example, he tells the story of Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, who you might know is a very famous Islamic scholar,
Yes, I do.
who was imprisoned and tortured.
Oh, wow.
Pretty heavy stuff, right?
That's intense. I mean, not exactly what I was expecting when I picked up a book about happiness.
Right. But here's the interesting part. Even while he was being tortured, Imam Ahmad found solace in writing.
Really?
He actually managed to complete an entire book while he was in prison.
Wow, that's incredible.
Mm.
But I don't know, how does that tie into finding happiness? Was he just trying to distract himself from the pain?
It's deeper than that. The author uses this story to illustrate the concept of preordainment, which is it's a core belief in Islam that everything that happens is part of Allah's plan.
Okay, so even suffering, you're saying, is part of that plan.
Yes. And the idea is that accepting that can actually lead to a sense of peace. It's not about being passive,
Okay.
but it's about understanding that even difficult experiences have a purpose.
So instead of railing against hardship, we should try to, like, understand what lessons we can learn from it. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. And that can shift our perspective from feeling like a victim to seeing ourselves as being tested, refined by Allah.
That reminds me of the other story he tells about it's a French optimist.
Yeah.
Who's imprisoned. And even in prison, he was finding good in everything.
Yeah, that's a perfect example. The point is our experience of happiness isn't solely determined by our circumstances, but by how we choose to perceive them.
So even in the midst of hardship, are you saying that we can choose to focus on the positive aspects?
Yes. And that actually ties into another really key concept that the book keeps coming back to, which is the idea of seeking refuge in Allah.
Okay.
The book reminds us that He's always there for us, especially when we're struggling.
Mm-hmm.
And turning to Him in prayer, in supplication, can be a source of immense comfort and strength.
So it's like we always have this ultimate support system.
Yeah.
No matter what we're going through, Allah is with us.
Exactly. And that can be incredibly empowering. It allows us to face our challenges with greater courage and hope, knowing that we're not alone.
I'm starting to see how all of these different pieces fit together. Like the author is building this framework for happiness almost.
Mm-hmm.
And faith is like the foundation.
That's a great way to put it. The book really argues that true, lasting happiness, it's not about external circumstances.
Okay.
It's about aligning ourselves with the divine will and finding peace in that surrender.
And that peace then allows us to see the good in everything, even when things are tough.
Exactly. And that's really what the book is all about, is helping us to cultivate that inner peace, that deep contentment that allows us to experience true happiness, no matter what life throws our way.
This is getting really interesting. I feel like we've only just scratched the surface here.
I know, right?
So for our listeners, I hope this first part of our deep dive has given you a little glimpse into the wisdom of Don't Be Sad. And we're going to explore more of the book's insights in the next part of our deep dive, and hopefully discover how they can help us lead happier, more fulfilling lives.
Stick with us. Okay, so we were talking about finding that deep, lasting happiness, right, within the framework of Islam. But the author doesn't really shy away from the reality of sadness and, hardship, does he?
Yeah, not at all. I mean, he kind of dives right in and talks about all these ways that negativity can affect us. And he even uses some pretty interesting sources to kind of illustrate that point, like surprising sources.
Yeah, like he quotes a Nobel Prize winner in medicine, Dr. Alexis Carlisle, to highlight how stress and anxiety can take a toll on our bodies.
Yeah, I remember that. And he even connects that to the Islamic idea of surrendering to Allah's will, which is really powerful.
Right. It's like when we worry excessively, we're basically resisting the preordained plan. And that creates all this inner turmoil.
Mm-hmm. And then there's that other book he mentions, Dr. Edward Budowski's book, Stop Worrying and Seek Betterment. How did he tie that into the Islamic teachings?
Well, I think what's really fascinating there is that both the Islamic perspective and that Western perspective are both acknowledging that negativity, it can really damage us, not just mentally, but physically too.
Oh, yeah. And he even mentions things like ulcers and heart problems, even rheumatism.
Yeah, as being linked to stress.
Wow.
It's a reminder that our mental well-being and our physical well-being are totally interconnected, and negativity can really wreak havoc on both.
Okay, that's pretty scary. So what's the antidote then? How do we even begin to shift away from that negativity?
Well, the author keeps coming back to the idea of having a good opinion of Allah.
Mm-hmm.
He says, remember his mercy, remember his forgiveness, and let that ease your anxieties.
Oh, yeah. And there's that quote that really struck me from William James. He said that God forgives us our sins, but our nervous systems do not.
Whoa, that's a powerful one.
Yeah.
It really gets you thinking.
Yeah, and I think it kind of acknowledges the struggle we have,
Yeah.
Even when we know intellectually that Allah is merciful, sometimes our emotions just don't quite catch up,
They haven't gotten there yet.
Exactly.
Yeah. So we need to work on aligning that inner world
Okay.
with our faith.
Yeah, yeah. So how do we do that?
Well, the book actually offers some practical advice for doing just that. One thing that really jumped out at me was, you remember how he talks about embracing constructive criticism?
Oh, yeah, I loved that.
Yeah.
Like, use criticism as fuel for growth.
Instead of letting it get you down,
Yeah.
it's like reframing negativity into something productive. And that actually ties into this bigger principle of controlling our emotions, which he emphasizes a lot.
So you're saying we should step back and assess the situation before we react impulsively.
Exactly. Instead of just reacting to everything that comes our way, we choose a response that's aligned with our values. And the author even challenges us to zoom out and see the bigger picture. Like he quotes General George Grook, who said, "Life is too short to make it even shorter through disputes."
Okay. Yeah, that's a really good point. I think sometimes we get so caught up in these little arguments or anxieties that in the grand scheme of things really don't matter that much.
Right. It's a reminder to prioritize what's truly important, like our relationship with Allah, our good deeds, our preparation for the hereafter. And speaking of prioritizing, you remember that story about the man who was forgiven for all of his sins, but he was still worried about his lost camel?
Oh, yeah, that's a classic. It teaches us to really value what matters.
And not to let these minor worries consume us.
Yeah, and that actually brings us back to the idea that negativity can be contagious, doesn't it?
Right.
Like surrounding ourselves with positive people, engaging in good deeds. These are all ways to break free from that cycle of negativity.
Yeah, absolutely. And the author actually adds another really powerful tool to that arsenal, seeking knowledge. He presents it as an antidote to both grief and boredom.
Okay, so you're saying that learning, especially about Islam, can actually lift us out of sadness. I mean, how does that work?
Well, think about it. When we immerse ourselves in learning, our minds expand, we gain new perspectives, we challenge our assumptions, and we connect with something larger than ourselves.
And I remember he talks about starting each day with this firm resolve to be positive, to seize the moment, and not to dwell on the past or the future.
Yeah, that's such a powerful practice.
Yeah.
It's about consciously choosing to approach each day with a sense of hope and purpose.
Yeah, and I love that Quranic verse that he quotes. So hold that which I have given you and be of the grateful. It's a reminder to focus on our blessings, no matter how small they might seem.
And gratitude is such a key ingredient to happiness. That verse so beautifully encapsulates that.
This is really good. We're getting into the nitty-gritty now, the practical stuff. I'm really liking this. What other gems does he offer?
Well, he encourages us to break free from, blindly following others. He says, don't be a mimicker.
Okay.
Like, find your own path, guided by your own faith and your own values.
So it's not about conforming to some external standard of happiness, but it's aligning our actions with our deepest beliefs. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that's it. And he also reminds us that this world is temporary. Our true home is in the hereafter. And that perspective can bring so much comfort and liberation.
I love how he puts it. The entire world is trivial. For the entire world is trivial. It's like a mental reset button,
Yeah, that is.
for all of our worries.
Yeah, he wants us to detach from the things that ultimately don't matter and focus on what does, our connection with Allah, our good deeds, our preparation for the afterlife.
Okay. And he talks about the importance of good character, doesn't he? Then he even quotes a hadith, something about good manners elevating us spiritually.
It's such a good reminder that true happiness isn't just about internal feelings. It's actually reflected in how we treat others, how we embody those Islamic values in our daily lives.
And then he gives us those 10 gems for a good and noble life. And those are basically actionable steps that we can take to kind of align ourselves with those values.
Yeah, exactly. Like seeking forgiveness from Allah, reflecting on his creation, keeping good company. It's like a blueprint for a life that's full of meaning and purpose.
And he keeps coming back to this idea that faith is the ultimate remedy for sadness. I remember the story about the man who lost his ring, but was grateful that he still had his fingers.
Oh, yeah. It's such a simple story, but it speaks volumes about the power of perspective,
Yeah.
He lost something valuable, but he chose to focus on what he still had.
Yeah. And that choice, that shift in perspective,
Yeah.
is what ultimately determines our experience of happiness, wouldn't you say?
Exactly. And the author kind of urges us, he says, learn to deal with your reality.
Okay.
Accept what Allah has decreed. Find joy in simplicity and adapt to whatever circumstances you face.
I love the story he tells about the man who lost his arm, but then adapted so well that he actually found certain tasks easier to do with one arm than he did with two.
Right. It's like this incredible reminder that, our limitations, the things we think are holding us back, don't actually define us. And we have this incredible capacity to adapt and find joy even in, really difficult situations.
And then he reminds us, life is shorter than you think.
Yeah.
And he tells the story about the man who's diagnosed with this terminal illness, and then he decides to, really live. Yeah.
It's a wake-up call for all of us, right? Don't wait for some kind of crisis to realize how precious time is.
Right.
Embrace each moment, focus on what truly matters, and live with intention.
That kind of brings us back to that idea of contentment, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Remember how he says, as long as you have life's basic necessities, don't be sad.
It's like this powerful reminder that happiness doesn't depend on material wealth, right?
Yeah.
It's about appreciating what we have
Mm-hmm.
and recognizing that contentment is really a state of mind.
I think he even quotes Dale Carnegie, who said, happiness is a habit.
Oh, I love that.
It's like we can train ourselves to be happy, just like we train our bodies at the gym.
Yeah, that's such a good analogy. And the book kind of gives us the exercises we need for that mental workout.
So we've got all these practical tips, inspiring stories, powerful reminders, but how does the author tie it all together in the end?
Well, he circles back to that concept of preordainment. He says, our only escape from these anxieties and worries is to really believe that whatever is decreed will happen.
So it's about letting go of that illusion of control and surrendering to Allah's plan. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. And when we do that, we tap into this deep reservoir of peace and contentment.
It's like releasing the burden of trying to force things to go our way and instead aligning ourselves with the flow of the divine will.
That's beautifully put. And he also reminds us that we're not alone in this journey. He points to the prophet's companions as examples of people who found true happiness through their faith.
Yeah, their lives were filled with hardship and challenges.
Yeah.
But they remained steadfast in their belief and really found joy in serving Allah.
And they understood that true happiness wasn't about their external circumstances.
Right.
It was about the state of their hearts, their connection with their creator.
Yeah, and it's like they understood that even in the most difficult circumstances, you can still find that happiness and peace when your heart is connected to Allah.
Absolutely. And you know what else I thought was really interesting is how the author emphasized the importance of home
Oh, yeah?
as this kind of sanctuary from negativity.
Okay, yeah.
And he talks about the need to kind of isolate ourselves sometimes, not in a negative way, but as a way to reflect and grow spiritually.
Yeah, like creating that space for yourself where you can really reconnect with your faith and kind of recharge, I guess.
Exactly. And, it made me think about how important it is to have that kind of balance in our lives
Hmm.
between engaging with the world and taking time for ourselves to, just be with Allah.
That makes a lot of sense. And then, of
Hmm.
course, he talks about the importance of faith as this kind of like, I don't know, foundation for a fulfilling life.
Yeah, like even if we don't have all the material things that we think we want, true happiness comes from that belief, from that connection with Allah.
It's like that inner peace and contentment that we were talking about earlier.
Exactly. It's not about what's happening around us, it's about what's happening inside of us.
There's that beautiful analogy he uses about extracting honey without breaking the hive.
Oh, yeah, I love that one.
It's like this gentle approach to life,
Mm.
like attracting people with kindness and creating this positive environment.
Yeah, and he contrasts that with like the destructive nature of jealousy and how contentment with what Allah has given us, that's the key to counteracting those negative feelings.
Yeah, yeah, it's about appreciating what we have instead of constantly comparing ourselves to others.
Right.
And I think that ties into his advice to, like, just accept life as it is,
Mhm.
adapt to the circumstances, find joy in the simple things.
Yeah, and remember that this world is temporary. Our focus should be on the eternal bliss of paradise. And, speaking of this world being temporary, there's that story about Napoleon.
Oh, yeah, the one where he only found 13 happy days in his whole life.
Yeah. It really highlights the idea that happiness isn't about these fleeting moments. It's about cultivating a state of mind.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And that's what Islam teaches us, right?
Yeah.
To focus on the afterlife.
Yeah. To find solace and meaning even when things are tough in this world. Because our true reward is with Allah.
Okay, so we've talked about finding happiness, but the author also talks a lot about dealing with sadness, right? Like, he's not saying we should just pretend that negative emotions don't exist.
Right, exactly. He actually says that Islam encourages us to persevere through trials, to find solace in Allah.
But he's also saying that we shouldn't dwell in sadness.
Yeah, like we
Yeah,
shouldn't let it
well,
consume us,
right.
especially when it's over things that are, ultimately trivial.
Okay, so how do we do that? How do we prevent ourselves from getting bogged down by those insignificant things?
Well, he gives us a few really practical tips. One of them is to focus on the blessings in our lives. Because when we're grateful for what we have, it's harder to be sad about what we don't have.
Yeah, and I remember he tells that story about the man who was forgiven for all of his sins, but he was still worried about his lost camel.
Right. It's a reminder to prioritize our concerns and, not to let the small stuff overshadow the big stuff.
It's like that saying, don't sweat the small stuff.
Exactly. And, he also talks about the importance of surrounding ourselves with positive people because negativity can be contagious, but so can positivity.
That's a good point. And he also talks about like countering negativity with good deeds, right? Focusing on actions that bring comfort to our hearts and benefit others.
Yeah, it's about shifting our focus from ourselves to others. And he says that seeking knowledge is a powerful antidote to both grief and boredom.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, how does that work?
Well, when we engage our minds in learning, it kind of opens us up to new perspectives and insights, and it can distract us from our worries.
And I love how he emphasizes the power of smiling. Just something as simple as a smile.
It's like a form of charity that can uplift both the giver and the receiver.
And then there's the incredible story he tells about the prophet's companion who went to his death happily for the cause of Islam.
That's such a powerful example of how a positive mindset can help us overcome even the greatest fears.
Yeah, and it shows that true happiness comes from aligning ourselves with the divine will, even when it's difficult. And I think finally he talks about the importance of controlling our emotions, right? Not letting our grief or joy become excessive, but maintaining that balanced demeanor.
Yeah, it's about finding that middle path. And, in a world that constantly seeks external validation, I think this book offers a really powerful reminder that true happiness lies in aligning ourselves with the divine will, finding contentment in Allah's decree, and striving for a life that pleases him.
This deep dive into Don't Be Sad has been such an inspiring journey. We've explored the wisdom of Islam, practical advice for dealing with hardship, and ultimately, that path to finding true happiness. I encourage our listeners to explore this book for yourselves and discover how it can help you navigate life's challenges and find that lasting peace and contentment that we all seek. Until next time, may Allah grant us all ease and guide us to what pleases Him.
And upon you be peace.